Hi everyone, we're into the second last week of Justice Strategy and Alliances, and this week we're looking at resilience and sustainability. And these are some top level issues in terms of what it's like to work in the field of criminology and social policy, and I think it's something that's very useful for you as graduates to have a sense of and to have an understanding of, to understand how the sector operates, because it's not something we tend to talk about very much. And when we do get presented with the results of criminology research, we often get presented it in a vacuum. There's just like this research that appears out of nowhere, and here it is, here's the data. Whereas part of the strategy of actually working in this field is being able to understand what sort of research is going to be funded, what kind of programs are going to be sustainable, and what that's going to mean for you being able to be someone who participates in these successful loops of innovation that allow you to basically pay for your own job in the future. And it's always been the case that work in research has been really self-funded, and work in community programs and the public sector often has to be a sort of a mad scrabble to get you and your staff's positions funded for the next cycle. But that's something that's become more significant these days, and something I think that's very important as a junior criminologist, to be able to understand and to be strategic about where you work, the sort of work you do, in terms of being a success, and having those feedback loops allow you to continue further on. Because I don't think it's the case where you can just cross your fingers, pick a job that you like and hope that it'll continue. I think it's the case where increasingly you as an employee, as a professional, have to be pretty strategic in the things that you do and the choices that you make. Or at least you'll be more successful if you are. So there's a couple of two connected concepts here. We're talking about resilience and sustainability. Sustainability, of course, has become a big issue in terms of environmental sustainability, with the UN devoting a whole lot of attention to it, and nations pretending to put a whole lot of attention to it. But sustainability, and its simplest level, is just about setting up programs that you know will be able to continue. And you've probably seen it several times already in your studies. Really great programs, particularly youth-focused programs, that all of us, they have these great results, and then it's like, oh, and this program stopped being funded and it closed down. And that's the heartbreaking thing I think about criminology quite often, is that we're often reinventing the wheel. We're often reinventing programs that have already run successfully, and we don't get to be able to sustain them because we get enough funding for one cycle, and then it's quite difficult to get funding renewed, particularly if your program is out of alignment with current political interest. And to an extent, that's always been the case. It's always been the case that if what you're proposing sits well with the government or the king or the baron or whoever you're working for, you're more likely to get your program renewed. But it has become, in the last few decades, significantly worse, and there really has been a shift towards political parties and political representatives. I mean, they're not supposed to be representing their parties, but political representatives only funding research that aligns to their politics. And that's not always been the case. I mean, you go back to sort of even some fairly conservative governments, the Fraser government in Australia, and even Nixon in America, and you had a whole lot of interesting things being funded because they just saw, even though their politics were conservative, they saw their role as primarily being able to sort of fairly back research generally, and to see what the results were. But in the last 30 years or so, we've seen a very strong tendency for governments who hold a lot of the funding budget to only fund things that align with their agenda. And that's pretty bad. And that's really transformed the nature of criminology. in the 1970s, criminology was a very experimental discipline. I don't mean that as in wild and unaccountable, but a lot of work in criminology was done through experimentation. It was done in the coalface, in the community, with people, with longitudinal studies and everything else. And because of the withdrawal of funding for that sort of research, the cheapest kinds of research is just using official stats. So from the 80s onwards, we saw a very much conservative shift in politics. We saw the rise of neoliberalism, so even the traditional workers' parties became very, very conservative. And we saw this push towards supportive programs that supported the government. So if you said offenders are out of control, offenders need to be treated harshly, things that aligned with the government position, and that was conservative and so-called liberal governments alike, you did tend to get more funding, but there still wasn't much funding in it. And what your research really had to rely on was just looking at official statistics and working with those. And of course, there are problems with official statistics. And that pushed criminology in a particular area, a particular way of operating, where it became a lot less ambitious, a lot less focused on change, and a lot more on just now analysing crime stats. Because it's cheap to do. Much, much cheaper to do than actually sending someone out into the field to do something or setting up an experiment. Now, that's changed a bit, not because politics has gotten any nicer, but because politics has also been seeking to divest the state of a lot of its responsibilities in relation to things like poverty and social problems to NGOs and other organisations, with the idea of, oh, we'll just take the money we used to use to fund this government department and we'll send it out to these NGOs in the community to run. But that has meant, almost by accident, that there's been a bit of a return to looking at socially oriented criminology and looking at a kind of research that works with the community involved in setting up and testing programs. And I have no evidence yet that that's makes it easier to sustain programs and to renew programs when their times run out. We're going to have to wait and see what happens in that space. But it's definitely been a more positive move away from this idea of just looking at stats. And there's so little you can do with stats, realistically speaking. Except just sort of talk about whether the latest government intervention is successful or unsuccessful based on the stats, without any sort of qualitative data in there as well. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. The first part of this is sustainability. But the other part that's connected to that is resilience. It's being able to design and create resilient programs that can weather these sort of changes, and particularly can weather political changes. Because one thing with research funding being so politicised is if you get a change of government, one of the first things they do is strike down all the very political research programs that were aligned to the previous government's research. I mean, they can't. The money's out there, and they can't take it back usually. But what they can do is refuse to renew funding in something that they see as politically aligned to the other party. So that makes resilience quite difficult, just both financially but also politically, in being able to build, even your basic youth intervention, crime reduction program. It can't be too closely tied to a member of parliament, like an attorney general, or a political party's agenda, because you'll be on the chopping block if they lose office. But that's a delicate kind of game to be able to play, to build an organisation that's resilient, but pays enough fealty to the existing power mechanisms that you'll actually get funded in the first place. So yes, research has become vastly more politicised over the last sort of 40, 50 years. And it means, again, getting back to the themes of this course, that if you want to be successful in this field, you need to be more political. And while it's always been the case that researchers have always worked on short-term contracts, there are very few researchers who get to the point in their careers where they get ongoing jobs. You spend a lot of your time as a researcher, as a policy worker, on short-term contracts. It didn't used to be as precarious as it was. It used to be once you got a job as a researcher somewhere, you were pretty much guaranteed you'd get further work, as long as your work was good. Simply, you will just end up working on different research projects. And that seems to have changed a little bit too, with the kind of swinging us around research. So in terms of the notes this week, there's a bit of some discussion on sustainability. There's some discussion on there's a helicopter outside my window, which will probably get filtered out by the Camtasia, but you might not. You might hear some helicopter noises. Anyway, who knows what they're doing. All right, some discussion on affinity groups and networks, and I've tried to bring in a bit of more contemporary theory that takes us further than just saying it's good to have good networks, which is kind of common sense, and you don't need to pay massive amounts of money for a university degree to tell you that having good networks is good. But to also talk about different ways in which you can operate in those networks more successfully. And particularly, I think the use of affinity groups is becoming more interesting. That comes out of what we looked at last week in terms of mutual aid, and really does help you move beyond we need a team to do this, and we'll have someone who does all the work and everyone else who just, doesn't do anything. It allows you to identify the strengths of people within a team and to be able to create a team that's well designed around balancing all these different objectives that teams do. And that can be within a department, or it can be an alliance across different agencies as well. And it's worth thinking about if you want to, as we've said several times, I think, if you want to develop new programs and projects, having buy-in from multiple agencies is the way to go at present. And it makes it easier to administer if you have everyone who you need in the room with you, and you don't have to worry about one agency being on the outside because they're not involved. And it also, I think, inspires more confidence in the grant funding agency if there's a distributed sense of power, if they're not just relying on one agency. Also connected to that and connected to this week's reading is the idea of community involvement, both in the building of new projects and also just flowing that idea of resilience over to the community, because a lot of what we have been doing in criminology over the last couple of decades has been less about stopping or eliminating a problem and more about building community resilience around a problem and facing a problem, and enabling a community to do more to prevent the problem. So again, a lot of that comes from the fact that governments are saying we don't want to spend money or use government agencies to do as much anymore, even core business like crime prevention. But it also, I think, is more powerful because you can actually get a wider range of people involved, and you don't have the idea that if it's a crime prevention program, it has to be run by the police. That you can get the right people with the right skills and the right position, which may or may not include police, depending on the problem, but you can get those people in the room in a project. So, this all sort of wraps up with the challenge for this week, the second last challenge. Now, the challenge refers to one of the 4 major programs from the SIM, which you can just pick a major social problem. You don't have to. The ones from the SIM are the red cap problem, the random violence that we don't know the cause of, the fires, the bushfires, the contamination of the water, and the rise of fascism and neo-fascist organisations, the 4 there. But you can pick anything that's sort of an equivalent big problem and look at that issues of resilience and how it's happening now, I think, with the bushfires, that when we were in the panic mode with bushfires, we built a whole lot of structures and programs and ideas around, getting us prepared for bushfires, but we haven't had a significant number of bushfires for a few years, and everything seems to have gone out the window, and we're starting from scratch again. Now, if we had those programs were developed in a way that was resilient, that was sustainable, then we would be in a much better position now. So it's just think about, well, why does that happen, and what can we do to try and keep these programs active that can be successful, but they may not be visibly successful. A really good crime prevention program is going to be almost invisible, because you're not going to see. It's going to stop crime from happening, and then it's going to be very more difficult to sustain that, because people will say, well, we don't have any crime. Why do we need a crime prevention program? So there's some sort of logical issues involved with that stuff too. So that's what we'll be looking at in the workshop. The last thing I want to say is, next week's the last week, but also the surveys have come out. So please send me some feedback on the surveys. With a small class like this, it's always hard to get enough people to have a significant impact. But I'm really curious as to how you saw this unit going, particularly because of the last minute change we had to do because we couldn't run the simulation. But yeah, the university does get on my back and hassle me if I don't get enough responses to the surveys. But I genuinely am also interested in what your response is. And even if your response is just like, yeah, it was okay, please just take a couple of minutes to let me know. Yeah, it was just okay. Here are some things that would have made it more interesting for me. So you don't have to have a strong opinion on it. And in fact, if only the people with strong opinions give the feedback, then your feedback ends up getting skewed. So anyway, please take the time for this and all units to do that. I know you get heaps and heaps of these surveys that you have to do, but it is genuinely useful for us. And next week we'll look at wrapping everything up and seeing what we've learnt during this term.